The letter arrived before breakfast. It was not addressed to Eleanor. That was the first strange thing. Every letter that came to the Whitmore house, every invitation, every card, every carefully worded note from any man worth knowing, had always been addressed to Eleanor. For as long as Marguerite could remember, the post arrived in the morning and was placed at Eleanor's side of the table, without anyone even thinking to check whether another name might appear on the envelope. But on this particular Tuesday in late September, the silver tray carried something different. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dunning, paused at the dining room door, with a look on her face that Marguerite had never seen before. Not confusion exactly. Something closer to surprise, mixed with the effort of keeping that surprise hidden. She set the letter beside Marguerite's plate. Eleanor looked up from her tea. She looked at the letter. She looked at Marguerite. Then she looked back at her tea, very deliberately, as though she had not seen anything worth noting. But her jaw had tightened by a fraction, and Marguerite noticed, because Marguerite always noticed the things that other people assumed she was too quiet to see. Marguerite did not open the letter at the table. She was not the sort of person who made moments out of things. She tucked it into her dress pocket and finished her porridge and asked Mrs. Dunning whether the kitchen had remembered to order more of the dried lavender that their mother liked. She spoke in her usual way, which was careful and unhurried, and nobody at the table could have guessed that her heart was beating faster than it had in years. She opened it later, in the garden, sitting on the low stone wall near the old apple tree that had not produced fruit in a decade, but which nobody had ever thought to cut down. The morning was gray and cool. The garden smelled of damp soil and something faintly sweet from the rose bushes that Mrs. Dunning watered every other day without fail. The handwriting on the letter was very good, not the flamboyant looping script that some men used when they were trying to impress, but something steadier and more deliberate. Each letter formed with care, each word placed as though the writer had considered it before setting it down. It read, "Miss Whitmore, I hope this letter does not come as an unwelcome surprise. I am aware that we have only spoken once, and briefly, and that I have given you little reason to expect any correspondence from me. But I found, in the days following our meeting, that I could not stop thinking about something you said. You were standing near the bookshelf in the east room of the Ashfield house, and you told Lord Ashfield, who had asked your opinion of a particular volume, that the problem with most books written by powerful men is that they spend the first 100 pages explaining how they came to be powerful, and the last 20 pages saying something that could have been said in a letter. I laughed. I do not laugh easily. I am writing to ask whether you would be willing to correspond with me, not because I wish to be forward, but because I believe you are someone worth knowing. Yours sincerely, Edmund Cavendish." Marguerite read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the old apple tree for a long moment. Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Strelin, the man who had, by the estimation of every woman in their social circle, more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, more land than a man could walk across in a week, and more reasons to marry well than any other bachelor in England. The man who had sat across the room from Eleanor at the Ashfield gathering, and whom Eleanor had been determined to impress, adjusting her posture every time he glanced in her direction, laughing a little too brightly at Lord Ashfield's unremarkable jokes. He had not written to Eleanor. He had written to her, to Marguerite, the one who had been standing by the bookshelf because there was nothing else she particularly wanted to do, and the books were at least interesting. The one who had said something without thinking, not to impress anyone, but because Lord Ashfield had asked, and she had simply answered honestly. She should have felt triumphant. She did not. She felt something quieter and more complicated than triumph. She felt, very slowly, something that resembled the first light of a morning she had not expected to come. But first, before any of that, she needed to understand how she had arrived here, at this wall, in this garden, holding this letter, because this was not the life that had been arranged for her. This was not the story that anyone in the Whitmore house had ever thought to write with her name in it. Marguerite Charlotte Whitmore was 23 years old. She was the second daughter of George Whitmore, a man of modest but respectable fortune, who had spent the better part of his adult life trying to extend his social reach beyond what his income could comfortably support. She had brown hair that she wore plainly, brown eyes that she had been told were her best feature by people who clearly could not think of anything else to say, and a way of standing slightly apart from whatever group she was in, that her mother called awkward, and that Marguerite privately considered sensible. Her sister Eleanor was 26. Eleanor had golden hair and blue eyes, and a laugh that filled rooms. Eleanor had been called beautiful so consistently, and for so long, that beauty had become the first thing anyone said about her, the way one might say, a river is wet, not as an observation, but as a fact too basic to require comment. Eleanor moved through the world as though it had been arranged for her comfort, which, in the Whitmore household at least, it largely had been. Their mother, Catherine Whitmore, was a woman who had married for love and then spent the following 30 years quietly regretting that she had not married for position instead. She was not a cruel woman. She was simply one who had decided, early on, where the family's hopes should be placed, and had arranged everything accordingly. The best bedroom had gone to Eleanor, the dancing lessons, the introduction to the right people at the right gatherings, the gowns that cost more than was strictly wise. All of it for Eleanor, because Eleanor was the one who could make something happen. Eleanor was the card worth playing. Marguerite had understood this before she was old enough to have the words for it. She had understood it in the way that children understand things that adults do not explain, through watching, through the small accumulation of overlooked moments that eventually form a very clear picture. She had not been treated badly. She had been fed, and clothed, and educated, and taken to the same events as her sister. She had simply never been the point. She had been the background to Eleanor's foreground, the quiet room that existed so the bright room next to it could seem brighter by comparison. And she had, over the years, made her peace with this, or something close to peace. She had found her own satisfactions. She read widely, and remembered everything she read. She had taught herself enough about estate management by listening at doorways, and reading her father's correspondence, that she could have run a small property without any difficulty, though no one had ever thought to ask her about this. She had a sharp eye for the small ways people revealed themselves, a hesitation before a sentence, a glance held a moment too long, a smile that reached the mouth but stopped somewhere before the eyes. She had friends, careful ones, the kind who did not expect her to be dazzling, and who appreciated her for being reliable and honest. But she had never expected anything like this. She had never allowed herself to expect it, because expectation was a dangerous thing when you were the sister that nobody had ever particularly wanted to discuss. The Ashfield gathering had been, by any measure, a routine evening. Lord Ashfield hosted a small dinner and reception twice a year, always at his London townhouse, always with the same careful mix of people designed to make everyone feel that they were among the most interesting company in the city. Marguerite had attended because her mother had insisted the whole family attend, and because refusing would have required an explanation that Marguerite did not have the energy to give. She had spent the first hour near her mother, who was near Eleanor, who was near every person in the room worth being near. She had spent the second hour finding reasons to drift toward the edges, which was where she was most comfortable, and where nobody bothered her with the particular kind of polite conversation that felt like being asked to perform a very short play with no rehearsal. The bookshelf had been a genuine refuge. She had been genuinely reading the spines, genuinely considering whether to ask Lord Ashfield if she might borrow one, genuinely losing herself in the small pleasure of being alone in a crowded room. Lord Ashfield had come to stand beside her. He was a pleasant man of about 60, with white hair, and a tendency to ask questions he was actually interested in the answers to, which was rarer than it should have been. He had gestured at the shelf and asked her what she thought of the volume sitting at the end, a thick book written by a recently retired minister about his years in government. Marguerite had answered without thinking. She had said what she thought, which was that most books written by powerful men spent too long establishing the writer's importance and too little time saying anything of genuine use. She had said it in her usual tone, which was direct without being unkind. Lord Ashfield had smiled, and then, from somewhere behind her left shoulder, she had heard a short sound, not quite a laugh, more like the beginning of one, quickly contained. She had turned slightly and seen a man she did not know. Tall, dark-haired, with a quality of stillness about him that she had noticed immediately, because most people in that room were in constant motion, adjusting, performing, working to be seen. This man was simply present. He had been looking at her when she turned, and he did not look away when she caught his eye. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, not flirtatious, not calculating, something more like attention, genuine and focused. And then Lord Ashfield had said something else and she had turned back, and the moment had passed. She had not known who he was. She had not asked. She had spoken to him briefly before she left, not even a full conversation. He had said something about the book. She had said something about the author's earlier work being better, and they had parted with the kind of unremarkable courtesy that passed between strangers at events like this. She had not thought about it much afterward. She had gone home, helped Mrs. Dunning sort out a problem with the kitchen accounts, written a letter to her friend Clara, and gone to bed without giving the brief exchange any particular weight. 3 weeks later, his letter had arrived. Now, sitting on the stone wall with the letter in her hands, Marguerite thought about what to do with it. She could show it to her mother. She could already picture her mother's face, the rapid calculation that would happen behind her eyes, the forced composure, the questions that would come in a rush, and would all really be the same question. How does this benefit Eleanor? She could show it to Eleanor herself, but she could also picture Eleanor's face, and it was a picture she was not ready to see. She could throw it away and pretend it had never arrived. Or she could write back. She sat with that thought for a while. The garden was very quiet. A bird moved in the apple tree, without any great urgency. The morning stayed gray and cool, and indifferent to whatever was happening on the low stone wall beneath it. She went inside and sat at her writing desk. She chose her words the same way he had apparently chosen his. Carefully, without flourish. She thanked him for his letter. She said she was glad the comment about the book had amused him, since she had not intended it to be funny, but she supposed he was right, that there was something a little funny about it. She said she was willing to correspond, as long as he understood that she wrote the way she spoke, which was directly and without decoration, and that if he was looking for something more elegant, he should perhaps apply to someone else. She sealed the letter and sent it before she could change her mind. She did not tell anyone what she had done. This was, in the Whitmore household, a small but significant act. In a house where Eleanor's life was discussed at the breakfast table and planned across several rooms, and considered from every angle by their mother, and occasionally even their father, Marguerite had always had very little that was purely her own. She did not share news about herself, not because she was secretive by nature, but because there was rarely any news about herself worth sharing, and on the occasions when there was, she had learned that it would be measured against Eleanor's news and found smaller. This, she decided, she would keep, at least for now. In the weeks that followed, she kept her word to herself and to no one else. Letters went out from the Whitmore house, and letters came back, and all of them passed through Mrs. Dunning's hands, and Mrs. Dunning, who had been with the family since before Marguerite was born, and who had in that time developed a loyalty to Marguerite that was quiet and undemonstrated, but very solid, sorted the Morning Post without comment, and placed the letters where they needed to go. Eleanor received letters. Eleanor always received letters. Suitors and friends and invitations and social notes. A constant flow of correspondence that confirmed Eleanor's place in the world as someone worth writing to. Nobody noticed that Marguerite was also receiving letters now. Nobody thought to notice, because it was not in the shape of things they had learned to look at. The letters were good. That was what surprised her most. She had expected them to be formal, or to contain the particular kind of effort that men sometimes put into letters when they are trying to be impressive and do not quite manage it. Instead, Edmund Cavendish wrote to her as though he was continuing a conversation that had been interrupted and that he was glad to return to. He asked her questions, real questions, not the performative kind that were really just comments dressed up in a question mark. He asked her what she thought about things. He told her what he thought about things, with a frankness that she had not expected from someone in his position, someone who had, she imagined, spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said. He told her, in his second letter, that he found most social gatherings insufferable, and only attended them because his position required it, and he had not yet found a way around that requirement, that did not create worse problems than it solved. He told her that his estate in Strellan was the only place he genuinely liked being, which was inconvenient because most of his actual obligations were in London. He told her that he had 2 dogs named after historical generals, which he admitted was something he would not normally confess to anyone, because it sounded peculiar when said aloud, but which had seemed like the sort of thing she would find more interesting than peculiar. She wrote back about the dogs with more enthusiasm than she had felt about anything in months. She told him that she had always thought animals were better named after generals than after endearments, because an animal named Admiral or Wellington at least had some dignity when it misbehaved. She told him that she had never been to Strelin, but that she had read about the country up there, and that it sounded like the kind of place where a person could think without being interrupted. She told him that she also found most social gatherings difficult, but had developed over the years a set of strategies for surviving them, which she described in enough detail that he wrote back saying he had laughed out loud at her description of how to make a dull conversation appear interesting while actually thinking about something else entirely. He told her she was the most honest person he had written to in years. She told him that was either a compliment or an indication that he had been writing to the wrong people. He said it was both. By the 6th letter, she was reading his correspondence with a feeling she did not have a word for, something between warmth and alertness, a sense of being met somewhere. She had spent a long time being invisible in the way that plain, quiet, second-daughter women were invisible. She had built a life inside that invisibility. She had made it comfortable and honest and her own, but she had never stopped noticing, in the small hours of the night, the distance between what her life was and what it might have been if someone had simply looked at her once and seen what was actually there. Edmund Cavendish was looking. That was the strange and simple fact of it. He was the wealthiest man in 3 counties, the most sought-after bachelor in the country, the man that every family in their social circle would have given almost anything to secure for their daughter. And he was writing letters to the wrong Whitmore sister, asking her what she thought, and meaning it. She did not know what to do with this. She was not, by nature, a person who assumed things would work out well for her. She had learned too early that optimism was a form of wishful thinking that the world had no particular obligation to reward. Whatever this was, these letters, this attention, this man who laughed at the things she said without making her feel like she was performing, she did not allow herself to believe it would become anything more than what it was. She told herself that. She believed it, or tried to. She repeated it in the garden, and at her writing desk, and in the quiet moments before sleep. She was not entirely successful. Because something was changing, quietly, and without permission, in the life of the girl that nobody had desired, the daughter that nobody had planned for, the sister who had always stood at the edge of things. Something was beginning, slow and private and real, like the first impossible sign of fruit on a tree, that everyone had long since given up on. She kept writing, he kept writing. The gray autumn deepened around the Whitmore house, and nobody, not her mother, not Eleanor, not Lord Ashfield, not anyone in their entire social world, had any idea that anything had shifted. That was the last time in Marguerite Whitmore's life that the world would not know her name. The morning that Eleanor found out started the way most mornings in the Whitmore house started, with her mother talking at the breakfast table and everyone else listening, with varying degrees of attention. Catherine Whitmore was describing, in the kind of detail that suggested she had been awake since before dawn composing it, a plan for the coming month. There was a dinner at the Pemberton house that Eleanor must attend, because Lady Pemberton's nephew was visiting from Edinburgh and was reported to be very eligible, and it would be careless not to put Eleanor in his path. There was also the charity concert at St. Catherine's Hall, which was less about the music and more about the fact that the Devereux family always attended, and the eldest Devereux son was unmarried and apparently much improved since his unfortunate episode with his first investment venture, which had not, their mother was quick to add, been his fault entirely. Eleanor was nodding, with the practiced half-attention of someone who has heard variations of this particular conversation her entire life, and has developed the ability to receive it without actually engaging with it. She was looking at the window. It was a bright morning for October, the kind of morning that almost felt like late summer if you did not look too carefully at the trees. Marguerite was eating her toast and thinking about a letter she had received the previous afternoon. Edmund had written about Strelin again. He had described the way the valley looked in the autumn, how the trees on the north hillside turned a particular shade of amber that you could not find anywhere else, how the light came through differently than it did in London. He had written, "I find myself describing it to you the way I would describe it to someone who might one day want to see it. I am aware that is forward of me. I am choosing to be forward." She had read that sentence 4 times. Marguerite. She looked up. Her mother was watching her with the expression that meant attention was required. "You are not listening." "I apologize. You were talking about the Devereux son. I was asking whether you heard anything useful at the Ashfield gathering last month. You were standing near Lord Ashfield for part of the evening. Did he say anything about the Cavendish business?" Marguerite set down her toast. What Cavendish business? Her mother waved a hand. There is talk that the Duke of Strelin may be considering property in this county, which would mean he would need to attend various local functions, which would mean that if Eleanor were to be visible at the right events. He did not mention any property, Marguerite said, which was true. Edmund had not mentioned property in that context. He had mentioned, in passing, that his solicitor was handling some business nearby. But that was entirely different. Her mother looked dissatisfied. Eleanor looked up from the window. She looked at Marguerite with something that was not quite suspicion, and not quite interest, but was somewhere between the two. "Do you know anything about him?" Eleanor asked. Her tone was light. She was good at that, at making questions sound casual when they were not. "Not really," Marguerite said. "He seemed quiet." Eleanor nodded slowly, and looked back at the window. 2 days later, Mrs. Dunning brought the Morning Post, and the letter addressed to Marguerite was the one on top, and Eleanor was already at the table when it arrived, and she saw it. She did not say anything. She watched Mrs. Dunning set it by Marguerite's plate. She watched Marguerite pick it up and glance at the handwriting, and set it beside her cup without opening it. She watched all of this in the way that Eleanor watched things she was filing away for later, with a particular kind of stillness that Marguerite had always associated with a cat, watching a bird it was not sure it wanted to chase yet. Marguerite ate her breakfast and talked about the weather, and carried the letter upstairs afterward without hurry. She did not look at Eleanor as she left the room. She heard, behind her, the sound of her sister's cup being set down, with more precision than tea usually required. She was in her room reading the letter when Eleanor knocked. She considered not answering. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her writing desk and said, "Come in." Eleanor came in, the way she did everything, with a quality of movement that suggested she was always slightly more important than wherever she was arriving. She closed the door behind her. She looked at the writing desk, and then at Marguerite, and she said, without any preamble, "Who writes to you?" "Friends," Marguerite said. "I know your friends. Clara writes to you on blue paper, and her handwriting looks like it is falling over. Beatrice uses the small envelopes from the stationer on High Street. I have never seen that handwriting before." Marguerite said nothing. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed, which she did without asking, the way she had done everything in their shared childhood without asking, because asking implied that refusal was possible, and Eleanor had never really considered that possibility. She looked at Marguerite steadily and said, "Is it a man? Eleanor, is it someone we know? I do not intend to talk about my correspondence with you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with less edge and more something else, something that Marguerite heard very rarely from her, "I am not trying to take anything from you, Marguerite." Marguerite looked at her. Eleanor's expression was different from usual. The performance was down, or most of it. She looked, in this moment, more like the girl she had been at 12 than the woman she had worked so hard to become since. "I saw the seal on the letter," Eleanor said quietly. "The crest. I recognized it." The room was very still. "He wrote to you," Eleanor said. It was not quite a question. Marguerite said, "Yes." Eleanor stood up. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she went to the door, opened it, and stopped with her hand on the frame. "He was looking at you at the Ashfield house," she said, without turning around. "I saw it, and I told myself I was mistaken." A pause. "I was not mistaken." She left. She pulled the door closed behind her, with perfect control. Marguerite sat in her chair, and listened to Eleanor's footsteps, moving down the corridor, toward her own room, measured and unhurried, the walk of a woman composing herself as she moved. The sound faded. The house settled back into its usual quiet. She opened the drawer, and took out the letter, and finished reading it. What followed were the strangest 3 weeks of Marguerite's life. Eleanor said nothing to their mother. This was the part that surprised her most. She had expected immediate disclosure, the story delivered to their mother at the first opportunity, the family convening around the information, the way they would have convened around a business matter. But Eleanor kept her own counsel, which was unusual, and watched Marguerite, which was not unusual, but felt heavier now. Their mother noticed nothing. She was occupied with the Pemberton dinner, which had produced a promising initial meeting between Eleanor and Lady Pemberton's nephew, a young man named Harold who seemed pleasant if not particularly inspired, and who had danced with Eleanor twice and sent flowers the following week. The flowers were pink, and their mother had placed them on the parlor mantelpiece and referred to them in conversation 3 times on the same day. Harold was, for the time being, the project. This gave Marguerite space. She used it. Letters continued to go out and come back, and they grew, in a way she had not expected, more personal. Edmund wrote to her about his father, who had died when Edmund was 19, and left him with the title and the estate, and a set of responsibilities that a 19-year-old was not fully equipped to carry. He wrote about it without self-pity, which she appreciated. He wrote about the mistakes he had made in the first years, the decisions taken too quickly, the people trusted who should not have been trusted, the learning that had only come through the ordinary process of being wrong. He said that he had spent a long time after that being more careful than was perhaps necessary, that caution had become a kind of habit that was hard to break. She wrote back about her own version of this. She told him about the particular education of growing up the overlooked child in a family that had a favorite. Not that she would have used that word, she said, but the fact of it was plain enough. She said she had learned to observe very carefully, because observation was the main tool available to someone who was not going to be handed anything. She said she thought it had made her more useful in certain ways, and more solitary in others, and that on most days, the useful outweighed the solitary, and on some days it did not. He wrote back, "You have described something I have experienced from an entirely different direction. I was given everything, and found that it made me deeply uncertain about what was real." She read that, and something in her chest moved in a way that she had not felt before. She understood now, in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that was painful, but the kind that unsettled everything you had arranged about yourself, the expectations you had set to a manageable level, the areas of your life you had learned not to want things from, that kind of trouble. Eleanor knocked on her door again 10 days later. This time she came in without waiting and sat down in the chair by the window, which was a change in itself, because that was usually Marguerite's chair, and Eleanor's presence in it shifted the room in a small but pointed way. "I want to know how serious this is," Eleanor said. "I do not know. Do not be evasive. You are the least evasive person I know. You choose not to tell things. That is different from being evasive." Marguerite conceded this with a small nod. "He has written to me every week for nearly 2 months." Eleanor absorbed this. "And you to him?" "Yes." "What does he write about?" "Things he thinks about. Things that matter to him. He asks my opinions, and he pays attention to what I say." Eleanor was quiet. She looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the October garden was bare, and the sky was the color of old pewter. She looked back at Marguerite and said, with a flatness that was not unkindness, but was honesty, of a specific and uncomfortable kind, "You know what people will say. I have some idea. They will not understand it, any of it. There is no version of this story that society receives well. Either they will say he is amusing himself at your expense, or they will say there is something wrong with him, or they will say our family has engineered it somehow. They will not simply accept that he chose you." "I am aware," Marguerite said. She said it without bitterness, because she was aware, genuinely and completely, and she had been sitting with that awareness for weeks. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the door, and then stopped, and for the second time she paused with her hand on the frame. "I am not going to tell Mother," she said. "Not yet. I want you to understand that I am choosing that." "Thank you." "Do not thank me as though I am being generous," Eleanor said. "I am being strategic. I want to see how this develops before anyone starts interfering." A pause. "And I want you to know that I am not—" She stopped, started again. "I do not think this is wrong. I think it is improbable. But improbable and wrong are different things." She left. Marguerite sat and thought about that for a long time. It was the closest thing to support that Eleanor had ever given her, and it had come in such a characteristically Eleanor fashion, strategic, honest, and tied up in self-interest but not entirely dishonest about that she almost smiled. She wrote to Edmund that evening. She did not tell him what had happened with Eleanor, but she did ask him, directly and without apology, what his intentions were. She said she was not asking to put pressure on anything, and she was not asking because she needed a particular answer in order to continue writing to him. She was asking because she was the kind of person who preferred to know what she was actually dealing with, and uncertainty of a specific kind was harder for her to manage than a clear and honest truth, even if that truth was unwelcome. She sealed the letter and sent it. His reply came 4 days later. It was shorter than his usual letters, but it was the kind of shortness that meant a thing had been thought about carefully before being said, not the kind that meant it had not been thought about at all. He wrote, "My intentions are serious. I am aware of what that means, and I have considered it from every direction. I do not make decisions impulsively. I make them, when I make them, with a great deal of care, and very little capacity for being dissuaded from them once they are made. I would like, if you are willing, to meet." She read it once. Then she put it in the drawer with the others. She was willing. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday afternoon, at the house of Lord Ashfield, who had offered his library as a neutral and unobtrusive venue. Lord Ashfield knew, because Edmund had asked him to arrange it, and because Lord Ashfield was one of those rare men who understood both discretion and genuine human warmth, and exercised both, without making a performance of either. Marguerite told her mother she was going to the circulating library with Clara. She told Clara, who was her most trusted friend, that she was going somewhere else, and would explain later. Clara, who had known Marguerite for 11 years, and who had learned that pressing her for information, before she was ready to give it, was a reliable way to get nothing, simply said, "All right," and changed the subject. She arrived at Lord Ashfield's house at 2:30. The butler showed her to the library without any visible reaction to her presence, which she appreciated. Lord Ashfield himself came to greet her, offered her tea, said he would be in the garden if she needed anything, and then removed himself with such practiced casualness that she knew he had been doing this for a long time. Edmund arrived 8 minutes later. She heard the door, and then his footsteps on the wood floor, and she stood up from the chair where she had been sitting, with her hands folded in her lap, because sitting while someone walked toward you required a particular kind of composure that she was not sure she had at this specific moment. He was taller than she remembered, or the room made him seem so. He was wearing a dark coat with no particular ornamentation, and his expression as he came in was the one she had seen at the Ashfield gathering, attentive and still, without the social warmth that other men put on like a jacket when they entered a room. He stopped a few feet from her and said, "Miss Whitmore." "Your Grace," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about how to begin this, and I have not arrived at a satisfactory approach, so I am going to begin without one." "That seems sensible," she said. He sat down. She sat down. Lord Ashfield's library was a good room for this, full of books and morning light, and the particular quiet of a space that had seen a great deal of thinking. She felt it help, a little. "The letters have been, for me, something unusual," he said. "I want to say that first, because it is true, and because I think you will appreciate directness more than a build-up." "I do," she said. "I am not a man who writes letters easily. I write a great many of them because my position requires it, and I am capable enough with language, but the sort of letters I have been writing to you are not something I do. In 20 years of social life, I have not written to anyone the way I have been writing to you." She watched him. He was not nervous, exactly, but he was not entirely comfortable either, and this surprised her. She had expected someone in his position to be more certain. He had more power than any man she knew. He had no reason to be uncertain about anything, but there it was in his hands, which he held loosely in front of him, and in the particular care with which he was choosing his words. "I want to know," he said, "whether the letters have been the same for you, or whether they have been something more ordinary." "They have not been ordinary," she said. He held her gaze. "Good. Although," she added, "I want to say something that may be uncomfortable. Please. I am not the same as the people you usually know. Not in the way that is a compliment to myself. I simply mean that I am not practiced at the things that women in my position are usually practiced at. I am not skilled at allowing a man to think he is guiding a conversation that I am actually guiding. I am not skilled at making my opinions sound like suggestions. I will sometimes say things that are direct to the point of bluntness, and I will mean them, and I will not be able to pretend afterward that I meant something softer. I want you to know this before anything proceeds further, because I think it is fair." Edmund Cavendish looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the first real warmth she had heard in his voice, "Miss Whitmore, that is the most specific and generous warning I have ever received, and it has made me more certain about this, not less." She felt something loosen in her chest. "All right," she said. They talked for 2 hours. This surprised her, though it probably should not have, given the length and nature of their correspondence. They talked about the things they had written about, and found that conversation was not a diminishment of the letters, but an extension of them. The same frankness, the same quality of actual exchange, with the added dimension of watching each other's faces, and finding that what was there matched what had been on the page. He was funnier in person than his letters suggested, not frivolously so, but with a kind of dry and quiet humor that appeared without warning, and then disappeared again, before you had quite decided how to respond to it. She liked this. She had always been suspicious of men who were broadly charming and broadly funny, because broad charm was often a way of being present in a room, without actually being present. Edmund's humor was specific. It arrived in relation to things, real things, and it came from a mind that was paying attention to the world, not performing for it. He asked about her family, and she answered honestly but without grievance. She said her mother had always concentrated her energies on Eleanor, and that this was understandable given Eleanor's qualities, and that she herself had found it more useful than hurtful in the long run, because it had meant she had grown up in a kind of freedom from expectation. She said it without bitterness, and she meant it without bitterness, and he listened without the uncomfortable pity that people sometimes produced when she touched on this subject. He said, "I think the freedom from expectation is, in many ways, the more valuable thing. I have lived my entire life inside a set of expectations so thoroughly established that deviating from them feels like removing a stone from a wall and watching the whole structure shift." She thought about this. "Does that mean you always do what is expected?" "No," he said. "It means I choose my deviations carefully." She looked at him steadily. "Is this one of them?" He met her eyes and said, "Yes." The afternoon light was beginning to change by the time they noticed how long they had been sitting. Lord Ashfield reappeared with the timing of a man who had been measuring the light from the garden and had decided that 2 hours was enough without being too much. He brought more tea that nobody drank and made comfortable conversation for 20 minutes, and then Marguerite stood and said she needed to be home before dark, and Edmund stood and said he would arrange her carriage. At the door, while Lord Ashfield was speaking to someone in the hall, Edmund said to her, very quietly, "I would like to do this again." "So would I," she said. "I would also like, if you are willing, to speak to your father." She felt her heart do something complicated. She had known it was a possible direction. She had thought about it in the abstract, but hearing it said aloud, in this library, in this afternoon light, was a different thing entirely from thinking about it. She said, "I think that is something we should discuss more before it becomes a plan." "Of course," he said. "I am not in a hurry." A pause. "That is not quite true. I am not in a hurry for any practical reason. I am considerably more eager than I would normally admit." She looked at him, and something happened in her expression that she did not quite control, a small real smile that arrived before she had decided to let it. "That is the most human thing you have said today," she told him. He smiled back, and it was, she would think later, a proper smile, the kind that came from somewhere real and did not stop at his mouth. She went home. She made it through dinner with her mother, and Eleanor and her father, who had not been part of any of this, and who ate his soup in the comfortable obliviousness of a man who believed that the domestic life of his household was roughly in the order he assumed it to be. She made it through her mother's report on a letter received from Harold, whose second visit to the Pemberton household had apparently gone well, and Eleanor's measured responses to their mother's enthusiasm, and her father's occasional comments about the weather. She went to her room, and sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. She was thinking about what he had said, the carefully chosen deviation, the fact of being chosen, not as the better option, not as the surprising choice, not as anything other than the specific and considered answer to a question he had apparently been asking himself for years. She turned this over and looked at it from different sides, the way she handled any piece of information that mattered, and she found that it held up. It was not something she had been told. It was not a compliment designed to make her feel something. It was the truth of a man who was capable of it, which was, she was beginning to understand, a rare and particular thing. She finally picked up her pen and wrote, not to Edmund, but to Clara. "I need to tell you something," she wrote. "It is strange, and I do not quite know what to do with it yet, but I know I need to tell someone, and you are the only person I trust with anything real." She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing post. Then she opened the drawer where she kept Edmund's letters, She did not take them out, she just rested her hand on top of them for a moment, feeling the edges of the paper through her palm. Outside, the October night was cold and clear, and the stars were coming out one by one. In the Whitmore house, her mother was already planning Eleanor's next appearance in the right places, and her father was probably in his study, reading about agriculture, and Eleanor was in her room with her own thoughts, which Marguerite could not read and did not try to. And Marguerite was here, in her room, with her hand on a drawer full of letters from a man who had looked past everything she was supposed to be and found her anyway. She thought, I do not know how this ends. Then she thought, I am not afraid of not knowing. This was new. This was not something she had felt before, the absence of fear, the strange, quiet steadiness of someone standing on ground she had not known existed, finding it solid, finding it real. She was not afraid. She went to bed and slept better than she had in years. Clara's response arrived 2 days later and read, in its entirety, I knew something was happening. You have been writing to me about books and weather for 2 months, and the weather sentences were too long, which is what you do when you are thinking about something else. Tell me everything immediately. Marguerite smiled and wrote back everything, or almost everything. She wrote the version that was true without being complete, the letter at the beginning, the correspondence, the meeting at Lord Ashfield's house, the things that had been said, and what she thought they meant. She wrote it without asking Clara to keep it secret, because she trusted Clara to understand what was implied, and Clara always did. Clara wrote back within a day, which meant she had not slept before writing, which meant she had been more affected by this than her usual composure would have suggested. She wrote, I have been thinking about what to say, and I keep arriving at the same thing, which is that I am not surprised. I have always thought you were extraordinary. I am simply glad that someone with the power to do something about it has noticed. Marguerite read this, and folded it, and put it in the drawer with Edmund's letters. She did not know quite what to do with being called extraordinary. She had been called many things over the years, and extraordinary was not one of them, and the word sat in her chest like something that needed time to settle before she could look at it clearly. The world outside the Whitmore house was continuing its ordinary operations. November arrived in the form of cold mornings and the smell of coal fires, and the social calendar tightening into the pre-winter sequence of events that London always produced. Concerts, dinners, charitable exhibitions, the particular kind of indoor gathering that society used to wait out the months between summer and the new year. Marguerite attended what she was required to attend, and avoided what she could avoid, and moved through the social world the way she always had, with the slight but practiced invisibility of someone who had learned where the edges were. Except that things were not quite the same. Edmund had begun, very carefully and with a deliberateness that she recognized as characteristic of him, to be slightly present in the same spaces she was in, not always, not obtrusively, but he would appear at the same charitable concert that she was attending with her mother and Eleanor, and he would find, in the natural course of the evening, a few minutes of legitimate conversation with her that nobody could have objected to. He would sit near enough to her at the Devereux dinner that it was possible to exchange quiet comments about the food without anyone particularly noticing. He was, she realized, managing the situation with a care and a subtlety that impressed her, because it was not the subtlety of concealment, but the subtlety of someone who understood timing. She understood what he was doing. He was creating a record, a visible, normal, unsensational record of encounters that could, if needed, explain the connection between them, without requiring anyone to be surprised. He was not hiding anything. He was simply introducing the fact of their acquaintance to the world at a pace that did not require the world to absorb everything at once. She wrote to him about this directly. She said she had noticed, and she wanted to know if she was reading it correctly. He wrote back, You are reading it correctly. I have given this considerable thought. The situation, as it stands, is known to Lord Ashfield, who will say nothing, and to your sister, who I understand has said nothing, and to me and to you. That is a narrow number of people, and it cannot stay narrow indefinitely. I am not prepared to proceed as though I am doing something that requires hiding, but I am also aware that the manner of a thing's disclosure shapes how it is received, and I would prefer to manage that where I can. She wrote, What do you intend to do? He wrote, I intend to speak to your father before Christmas. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about her father, George Whitmore, a gentle and somewhat bewildered man, who had spent his adult life slightly outpaced by his wife's ambitions, and who had, over the years, developed a habit of agreeing with things he was not entirely sure he understood. She thought about what a visit from the Duke of Strelin would mean, landing in the Whitmore household like a stone in still water, and the rings it would send out. She thought about her mother. She wrote back, "Before you speak to my father, I would like to speak to my mother myself. I think this news will go differently if she hears it from me first, rather than arriving as a fact she has not been prepared for." He replied, "That is wise." When, she thought, the longer she waited, the more chance there was for something to go wrong. She had been in the world long enough to know that things did not stay contained. Secrets developed their own gravity, and eventually collapsed. Eleanor knew. That was already a variable she could not fully control, and Eleanor, for all her current discretion, had her own interests, and her own calculations. Harold's flowers had stopped appearing after the third week. The Pemberton dinner's nephew had, it turned out, been mentioned in connection with a young woman in Edinburgh, whose name nobody was supposed to know yet, but which everybody was beginning to know. Their mother's project was drifting, and a mother whose project was drifting was a mother who was going to look for a new one. She wrote, "This week." He replied, "Tell me when, and I will arrange accordingly." She chose a Tuesday. She chose it because on Tuesdays her father was always home in the morning, because it was his habit to deal with correspondence before noon, and because her mother had no standing engagements until the afternoon, which meant there was a window of time in which the information could land and settle before any social obligation required either of them to be composed in public. She went to her mother on Monday evening. She waited until after dinner, when her father had gone to his study, and Eleanor had gone upstairs, and her mother was sitting in the parlor with her needlework, and the particular kind of tiredness that came from an evening of maintaining appearances. "Mother," she said, "I need to tell you something." Her mother looked up. She had the expression of a woman, braced for minor disappointment, because in her experience, news from Marguerite was rarely dramatic in any direction. Marguerite sat down across from her and said, without decoration, "Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Strelin, has been writing to me for almost 3 months. We have met in person once. He intends to speak to father this week about the possibility of pursuing a formal courtship." The needlework stopped. Her mother said nothing for so long that Marguerite counted, in her head, to 11 before the silence broke. "He has been writing to you," her mother said, finally. The words came out flat, like a surface had been pressed over them. "Yes. For 3 months. Almost, since October. And you did not tell me." "No." Another silence. Marguerite watched her mother's face work through several things in rapid succession. She saw the disbelief. She saw it give way to something else. The quick, involuntary calculation. The repositioning of known facts. She saw her mother look at her with an expression she had not received before. An expression that contained, buried under the shock and the confusion and the effort of comprehension, something that took her a moment to identify. It was reassessment. The look of someone adjusting a map they had been using for years to account for a geography they had not known was there. "Edmund Cavendish," her mother said again, as though saying it a second time would help it make sense. "Yes." "The Duke of Strelin." "Yes." Her mother set down the needlework with very careful movements. "How?" she said, not as a sentence, just the word by itself. Marguerite explained. She explained the Ashfield gathering, and the bookshelf, and the comment about the book and the letter, and everything that followed. She explained it simply, and without apology. She did not dress it up, and she did not soften the fact that she had kept it to herself. But she also did not pretend that this had been wrong, because she did not think it had been wrong. Her mother listened in complete silence. This was unusual. Her mother was not, as a rule, a woman who listened in complete silence. She had opinions at high volume, and she shared them freely. But she listened to all of this without saying a word, and when Marguerite finished, she sat for another long moment before she spoke. "Eleanor did not tell me," she said. "Eleanor found out a few weeks ago. She chose not to tell you." Her mother processed this. Then she said, very quietly, "Why did he choose you?" The question landed the way it was meant to, or perhaps the way it was not meant to, but the way it came out regardless. It was not cruel. Her mother was not being deliberately cruel. She was simply asking the question that was most present in her mind. The question that the situation raised, and that her mother, being her mother, did not know how to keep from asking. Marguerite said, "He told me it was because of the way I spoke about a book, and because of who I am in the letters." Her mother looked at her, and Marguerite looked back, and she did not look away, and something in the room shifted slightly. "He will speak to your father on Tuesday," Marguerite said. Her mother nodded. Once. Very small. Tuesday came. Edmund arrived at the Whitmore house at 10 in the morning, not in his grandest carriage, and not with any ceremony, but with a kind of measured quietness that she suspected was deliberate. He spoke to her father for 40 minutes in the study, behind a closed door that Marguerite did not stand outside of, though she wanted to. She sat in the parlor with her mother, who was very still and very quiet, in a way that was unlike her, but which Marguerite understood as a form of management. Eleanor had come downstairs and was sitting near the window reading something she was not actually reading. The door opened. Her father came out, and behind him, Edmund. Her father had an expression she did not have a word for, something between amazement and a sort of solemn pride that had no precedent that she could find in his usual face. He looked at Marguerite, and then looked at Edmund, and then said, with characteristic simplicity, "Well." Edmund looked across the room at Marguerite. His expression was the one she had come to know through the letters and the afternoon at Lord Ashfield's house, contained but real, present and clear. He said, "Your father has given his consent." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Eleanor turned a page she had not read. Marguerite held Edmund's gaze and felt the world she had been living in, the quiet, managed, expectation-free world she had built inside her family's scaffolding, begin to change its shape around her, not collapse, change, expand into a form she had not expected and had not allowed herself to expect. She said, "Then I suppose we should begin." Nobody in the Whitmore household had ever been good at keeping secrets, except for Marguerite, who was very good at it. And so it took less time than she had hoped for the information to reach the world outside the house. It began with Mrs. Dunning. Not from any indiscretion on Mrs. Dunning's part. She was, as Marguerite had always known, completely loyal and completely reliable. It began with the fact that a duke's visit to a private house was not an invisible event. Carriages were noted. Drivers spoke to other drivers. Grooms spoke to grooms. By the time Edmund's carriage had been on the road home for an hour, the Whitmore family's nearest neighbor, Mrs. Hartley, had seen it from her upstairs window, and had filed the fact away in the particular cabinet of her mind where she stored social information for later use. Within a week, the information had moved. Not as a confirmed fact, not yet, but as a question, with a strong suggestion attached to it. It moved in the way that information always moved in that world, through the mild inquiry, the carefully placed hint, the question asked in such a way that the asker already knew the answer they were looking for. People began to speak about Eleanor's prospects with a slight increase in their attentiveness, because the natural assumption, when a duke was seen at the Whitmore house, was that the duke had come about Eleanor. Eleanor was aware of this. She said nothing to correct it. Marguerite was also aware of it, and she understood why Eleanor said nothing, because to correct it would be to become the one who told the story, and Eleanor was not yet ready to be in that position. Their mother was the wild card. Catherine Whitmore had, in the days since Edmund's visit, been engaged in a private renegotiation with herself that Marguerite could observe but not fully understand. She had not told anyone outside the family. She had not, in the social encounters of the following week, said anything that was untrue. But she had also not said anything that was entirely true, and she had let the assumption about Eleanor stand in the rooms where it appeared, not by lying but by simply choosing not to correct what was being assumed. Marguerite watched this happen and said nothing, because she was trying to understand it before she responded to it. She thought her mother might be afraid, not of Edmund, and not exactly of the match. She had recovered from the initial shock of it quickly enough, and had, within 2 days, begun to see the social advantages with the clarity that was characteristic of her. She thought her mother was afraid of the story, of the shape of it, of how it would look when it was known. A duke choosing the overlooked daughter, the wrong Whitmore. It was, whichever way you arranged it, an irregular narrative, and Catherine Whitmore had never been comfortable with irregular narratives. Edmund visited again. He came on a Friday, and this time the visit was less private. Her mother received him in the parlor, with a determination to do the thing correctly, and Eleanor was present, and there was tea, and the formal pleasantries that the situation required. Edmund was very good at this. She had not known quite how good, until she saw him in her family's parlor, managing her mother's complicated manner, and her father's slightly dazed warmth, and Eleanor's watchful silence, with a quality of ease that did not look like effort, but clearly was. He spoke to her mother with genuine interest, and with the kind of respect that acknowledged her importance without flattering it. He spoke to her father about the county, and about the estate, and about things that her father actually knew, which was a tactful choice, because her father's confidence in conversation improved enormously when the subject was familiar. He sat near Marguerite, but did not ignore the room for her. He was not performing. He was simply present in a way that included everyone in it, and she watched this, and felt something that was both admiration and the small, clear pleasure of being seen by someone who also, clearly, knew how to see other things. After he left, her mother said, in the kitchen voice that meant she was being practical rather than social, "He is very good." Marguerite, who had not expected this particular comment, said, "Yes." "I mean," her mother said, as though clarifying for herself rather than for Marguerite, "he manages himself well. He makes people comfortable." A pause. "He did not make me feel as though I should be uncomfortable about the situation." Marguerite said, "Are you uncomfortable?" Her mother considered this. "I am adjusting," she said, which was the most honest answer she had given in some time, and Marguerite received it with the care it deserved. The following Saturday, the Whitmore family attended the monthly gathering at the Latimer house. This was a large and well-attended event, the kind that mixed several different layers of society in a way that Lady Latimer had spent 30 years perfecting, and it was the closest thing their social world had to a general assembly. Edmund was expected to attend, though she had not known until that morning, when he sent a note confirming it. She dressed with more attention than usual, and then changed her mind twice, and then arrived at something plain and well chosen, and went downstairs to meet her family at the door. Her mother looked at her, just for a moment, with an expression that was not quite the old expression, and not quite a new one. Then she turned back to putting on her gloves, and they went. The Latimer house was full by the time they arrived. Lights and voices, and the particular warm density of a large gathering in a well-appointed room. Marguerite followed her family into the crowd, and immediately felt the familiar sensation of being in a room too full of people, which she handled in the usual way. She found a wall with a good view of the room, and positioned herself beside it, and prepared to wait out the socializing. Eleanor was claimed within 10 minutes by a group of women who had heard something about Harold, and wanted to commiserate, or congratulate, it was not entirely clear which. Their mother moved toward Lady Latimer, with the purposefulness of a woman who had something specific to accomplish. Her father found an older gentleman he knew from the county council, and was immediately absorbed in a conversation about drainage. Marguerite stood by her wall, and surveyed the room. She could see, from this position, the way the crowd moved and regrouped, the clusters of women comparing notes about the season, the men in the corners discussing things they assumed women were not interested in, the young people near the refreshments who were primarily interested in each other. She could see Lord Pemberton's wife speaking with an animation that suggested new information. She could see Mrs. Hartley, the neighbor who had seen Edmund's carriage, standing with 3 other women, and speaking with a lowered voice and a raised chin. She understood, watching Mrs. Hartley's chin, that she was speaking about the Whitmore household, and she understood, from the direction of Mrs. Hartley's glances, which periodically found Eleanor across the room with a speculative quality, that the assumption was still in operation. Edmund arrived 35 minutes into the evening. She knew it before she saw him, from the slight change in the quality of attention in the room, the small adjustment that happened when someone significant entered. She watched the room orient itself, subtly and without being obvious about it, toward the door. He came in with 2 men she did not know, spoke briefly to Lord Latimer, and then began to move through the room in the expected way, greeting people, accepting greetings, managing his own social obligations with the same quiet competence she had seen at her family's parlor. She watched him. She did this without particular effort, because watching people accurately was simply what she did, and watching Edmund was, she would admit if she were honest with herself, something she did with rather more interest than most. He moved through the room. He spoke to Lord Pemberton. He spoke to the men in the corner. He accepted a drink, and held it without drinking it, which she noticed, because she had noticed him doing this before. He crossed the room at a pace that looked unhurried, but which was, she was fairly certain, moving him in a specific direction. He reached the wall. He stopped beside her and looked at the room the way she was looking at it, from the side, with enough distance to see the whole shape of it. "Mrs. Hartley," he said quietly, as though continuing a conversation they had already begun. "She has been discussing the carriage," Marguerite confirmed. "I expected as much." A pause. "Your sister is being watched." "I know. People expect you to have come for her." He turned slightly toward her and said, with a very quiet directness, "I have not come for her." She felt this in her chest. "I know," she said. They stood for a moment in the hum of the party. She was aware of the slight change in the space around them, the way that standing together shifted the configuration of the room slightly, the way that a few heads had turned in their direction and then looked away and would probably turn back. She said, "This is going to become known." "Yes," he said. "I intend it to." She looked at him. "Soon?" He looked back. "There is a reception at the palace in 3 weeks. I intend to make it clear then, publicly and without ambiguity." She thought about this. The palace reception was not a small gathering. It was the most significant social event of the season, attended by everyone who was anyone, reported on in every column that concerned itself with such things. If he was speaking about that reception, he was not speaking about a quiet correction of an assumption. He was speaking about something else entirely. She said, "You understand what that will mean?" He said, "Yes." She said, "It will be very public." He said, "That is the intention." She looked at the room, at Mrs. Hartley's chin and Eleanor's golden hair, and her mother's careful composure, and the entire complicated world that had, for 23 years, arranged itself around the idea that she was not the point of anything. She thought about the letter on the stone wall in the garden. She thought about the apple tree that nobody had cut down. She thought about reading spines of books in a room full of people who were not looking at her, and the moment when she had turned and found that someone was. She said, "All right." He said, quietly but with complete clarity, "You will not regret this." She said, "I know." She went home that night and lay awake for a long time, not with anxiety, not exactly, but with the particular wide-awake alertness of someone who understands that things are about to change, and who has chosen the change, and who finds, in the choosing, something that is much steadier than fear. 3 weeks, she thought. She could wait 3 weeks. The scheme was her mother's idea, or it began with her mother, at any rate, which meant it was Catherine Whitmore's doing, and the fact that Eleanor consented to it was a different matter entirely. It was 2 days before the palace reception when Marguerite first became aware that something was being planned without her knowledge, which was not, in itself, unusual. Things had been planned in the Whitmore household without her knowledge for as long as she could remember. What was unusual was the particular quality of the quiet, the way her mother and Eleanor moved through the house with a slightly different purpose than normal, a slightly adjusted arrangement of their presence, as though they were placing things carefully, and did not want her to notice the placing. She noticed. She was not the kind of woman who challenged things before she had enough information to be certain. She waited. She watched. And on the evening before the reception, when she came downstairs and heard her mother's voice through the half-open parlor door in a register that meant she was saying something significant, she stopped in the corridor and listened. Her mother was saying, "He has only seen her briefly, and in constrained circumstances. He writes to her. Yes, but letters are one thing. He does not know Eleanor. If Eleanor is present in the right way, if Eleanor is the one who arrives," and Eleanor's voice, quieter and more careful, saying, "He knows her handwriting." And her mother, "He knows a name. The name is Whitmore. If Eleanor is introduced correctly as Miss Whitmore." And Eleanor again, with something that was not quite reluctance, but not quite willingness either. She would find out. She would find out after, her mother said, by which time it would be managed. Marguerite stood in the corridor. She was very still. The hall was cold, and the candle on the side table was burning low. She thought about what she was hearing, and she thought about her own tendency to hear things clearly, and not immediately, to let them settle before they became something she acted on. She thought, My mother intends for Eleanor to go to the reception in my place, or alongside me in such a way that Edmund will be introduced to Eleanor first, under circumstances that blur the name or the identity, and whatever comes next will be decided in that confusion. She thought, Eleanor is not saying no. She thought, I need to decide what I am going to do about this, and I need to decide it before tomorrow. She did not confront them. She went quietly back upstairs. She sat at her writing desk, and she considered the situation, with the careful attention she gave to anything that required clear thinking. She wrote nothing. She thought. What her mother was proposing was, at its core, a substitution. It was built on the assumption that Edmund's attachment to her was either superficial enough to be transferred or specific enough to be managed, in the confusion of a large public event. It was, in the cleanest possible terms, an insult, both to Edmund's intelligence and to Marguerite's existence. But she could not say she was surprised by it, because she had never been surprised by the ways in which her family underestimated her. That was simply the condition she had lived in. What Eleanor was doing was more complicated. Eleanor was not enthusiastic about this plan. Marguerite had heard it in her voice. The hedging, the reservation. Eleanor was not the engine of this scheme. She was being asked to participate in it, and she was, for her own reasons, not saying no. She thought about those reasons. She thought about Eleanor, who was 26 years old, and who had spent her whole life being the point of everything, and for whom the reversal of this, the spectacle of her overlooked sister becoming the object of the most eligible man in the country, was a kind of displacement that had no precedent in Eleanor's experience of the world. She thought about the flowers from Harold that had stopped arriving, the promising dinner at the Pemberton house that had not produced a second dinner, the way that the season was turning, and Eleanor, by the calculations of their social world, was running out of time. She thought, Eleanor is not cruel, she is afraid. This did not make what was happening acceptable, but it made it comprehensible, which was different. She made her decision. She would go to the reception. She would go dressed and prepared, and she would not confront the scheme in advance, because confronting it in advance would create a battle inside the family that would serve no one, and would arrive at the palace reception with its wounds still open. She would simply go, and she would trust something she had not had much practice trusting. The clarity of a man who had spent 3 months writing her letters, that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he knew exactly who he had been writing to. She wrote to Edmund that night. She said, There may be some confusion tomorrow. I am telling you this without explanation, because the explanation is mine to manage, and I intend to manage it. I am simply asking you to be certain of who I am when you see me, and to act accordingly. She sent it with the late post. She did not know if he would receive it in time. She had to accept that uncertainty. She slept. Not easily, but she slept. The morning of the reception was bright and cold, the kind of clear November day that London produced occasionally, as a reminder of what good weather looked like. The Whitmore household was in motion earlier than usual. Her mother moved through the house with a contained energy that Marguerite had learned to read as her mode of determined operation. Eleanor was quiet, very quiet, which was more telling than noise. Marguerite dressed carefully, not elaborately. She was not trying to be Eleanor, had never been trying to be Eleanor, and was not going to start now. But she chose what she wore with intention, a deep blue that she knew suited her. Her hair arranged simply but well. The small pearl earrings that her grandmother had given her, which she wore rarely, and which had the quality of something that was genuinely hers. She came downstairs and found her mother in the hall. Her mother looked at her, and something passed across her face that was complicated and quick. The assessment, and the thing behind the assessment, and the thing behind that, which Marguerite thought might be something close to guilt, if her mother had been a woman more accustomed to guilt. "You look well," her mother said, neutrally. "Thank you," Marguerite said. Eleanor came down the stairs behind her, and Eleanor looked, as Eleanor always looked, beautiful. Gold and blue and composed. Marguerite did not feel diminished by this. She had spent too long being diminished by it to feel it anymore. She simply looked at her sister, and her sister looked back at her, and between them passed something that was not quite understanding, and not quite apology, but was something in the vicinity of both. They went. The palace reception was everything that palace receptions were, enormous and glittering and organized around the performance of power and wealth, in close proximity to one another. Hundreds of people. Light from chandeliers that could have lit a smaller house entirely. Conversations at high volume and considerable speed. The particular smell of such events, which was expensive and slightly warm. They arrived and were announced and moved into the crowd. Her mother angled toward Eleanor immediately, which was the usual configuration, and it was the configuration that served the plan. Eleanor at the center, visible, presented. Marguerite behind, or beside, or somewhere in the radius. She did not fight this. She moved with it. She moved into the room, and she positioned herself in the way she always positioned herself at such events. Aware, observant, at the edge where she could see everything. And she waited. He arrived 20 minutes later. She saw him before her mother did, and before Eleanor did, because she was watching the door from her position, and she knew the particular quality of presence that preceded him in a room, the slight adjustment of the crowd's attention. He came in with Lord Ashfield and 2 other men of his acquaintance, and he spoke to the receiving party and looked briefly at the room with the measuring stillness that was simply his way, and then his eyes moved, with what appeared to be complete naturalness, through the crowd, and found her. He found her immediately. Not Eleanor. Not the golden figure at the center of the assembled Whitmore family. He found Marguerite, standing at the edge of the room in deep blue, and his expression changed by a fraction that she suspected only she would have been able to read. His eyes held hers for a moment, then he began to move. Her mother had seen him now. She was adjusting, repositioning Eleanor, a small touch on Eleanor's arm that turned her slightly toward the direction from which he was approaching. The mechanics of the plan were in motion. He walked past the point where Eleanor stood. He kept walking. He stopped in front of Marguerite. He said, very simply and with perfect composure, "Miss Whitmore, I am glad to see you." The room around them was still doing all its usual things, conversations continuing, glasses lifted, social traffic flowing. But in their immediate vicinity, there was a silence that was specific and particular, the silence of several people who had expected something different and were recalibrating. Marguerite said, "I am glad to see you too." He offered her his arm, with the kind of ease that came from having decided something thoroughly before acting on it. "Will you walk with me?" She took his arm, and they walked together into the room, into the middle of the most significant social event of the season, and behind them, in the space where the plan had been and was not anymore, her mother stood very still, and Eleanor stood beside her, and neither of them said anything. The news spread in the way that news spreads in a room full of people who are both paying attention and pretending not to, quickly, quietly, and then all at once. Marguerite was aware of it as she and Edmund moved through the room together, aware of it in the way she was aware of most things, not from looking at it directly, but from the quality of the air around it, the angle of heads turning, the conversations that stopped half a sentence before they should have, and then resumed with a slightly different direction. She had spent 23 years learning to read rooms. She could read this one. He seemed aware of it too, in his own way. He did not perform for it. He did not angle himself for the room's benefit, or adjust his manner to suit whatever impression he thought was needed. He simply walked with her, and spoke to her, and when someone they passed required acknowledgement, he acknowledged them with the same contained courtesy he used for everything, and then returned his attention to her, as though returning to something important that had been briefly interrupted. They stopped near the large windows at the far end of the room. Outside, the November night was dark and sharp. The light from the chandeliers turned the window glass into a mirror, and in it, she could see, dimly, the shape of the room behind them. She said, "You received my letter." "This morning," he said. "You said there might be confusion." "There was a plan," she said, "my mother's. I will not describe it in detail because it reflects badly on the people involved, and I have no interest in doing that. I want you to know only that it was not Eleanor's design. She was persuaded into it, and she did not choose it freely." He listened to this without interruption. Then he said, "Are you asking me to think less of anyone?" "No," she said. "I am explaining it because I think you should know the shape of the family you are dealing with, and because I prefer not to begin anything real, on a foundation where you have less information than you should." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your family is afraid." "Yes. That is understandable." He looked at the room in the window's reflection. My family was afraid of everything I did that did not conform to expectation. My mother spent 3 years after my father died convincing herself that I would manage the estate incorrectly, and a further 2 years convincing herself I had married the wrong woman, except that I had not married at all, so she was anticipating a mistake that had not happened. She looked at him. Is she still alive? She died 4 years ago. She was, underneath all the anxiety, a very loving woman. A pause. She would have liked you. She had no patience for performance. Marguerite thought about this. That is the nicest thing anyone has said about me in some time. Then the people around you have not been paying sufficient attention, he said, without inflection, simply as a fact. They stood for a moment, in the light of the chandeliers and the dark of the window. Around them, the room continued its enormous elaborate performance. People circled and regrouped and laughed and calculated and arranged and managed, and in the middle of all of it the two of them stood quietly at the window, like something in an entirely different register of reality. He turned to face the room properly. She understood, instinctively, that something was about to happen. He said, quietly, not in a whisper, but in a voice pitched only for her, I told you I intended to make something clear tonight. Yes, she said. I am going to do that now. I want you to know in advance, so that you are not surprised. She looked at him. What exactly are you going to do? He said, something I have been wanting to do for approximately 6 weeks, which is to make it unnecessary for anyone to wonder, or speculate, or assume, because speculation and assumption have done nothing but create the kind of confusion that your mother's plan tonight was built on. He looked at her with the steady attention that she had come to understand was simply his nature, the way he met the things and people he considered important. I am going to speak to Lord Latimer. She knew Lord Latimer was present. He was the host of last week's gathering, and was tonight attending in his capacity as a family friend of the palace. He was, more to the point, someone to whom an announcement could be made, with the assurance that it would reach every person of consequence in the room before the evening was over. She said, Is that wise? He said, I have considered it at length, and I believe it is the right thing to do. Not for the sensation of it, and not to create a scene, but because you have been overlooked and misrepresented in this room for too long, and I am not prepared to let that continue when I have the ability to correct it. She was quiet. He said, I want your consent. I will not do it without your consent. She thought about her mother's face in the hall that morning. She thought about Eleanor standing beside the plan that had not been entirely her own. She thought about Mrs. Hartley's chin at the Latimer gathering, pointing at Eleanor with certainty. She thought about every dinner table, and every drawing room, and every event she had attended as the background, the shadow, the second daughter whose name you had to think about for a moment before you remembered it. She thought about the apple tree. She said, You have it. He nodded once. Then he said, Stay here a moment. He crossed the room. She watched him move through the crowd with the ease of someone who had spent his adult life navigating exactly this kind of room, and who was, on this particular evening, moving with a quality of purpose that she could feel from where she stood. He reached Lord Latimer, who received him with immediate attention because he was Edmund Cavendish, and immediate attention was what the world gave him. They spoke briefly. She could not hear what was said. She watched Lord Latimer's face change. Then Lord Latimer turned and spoke to the people nearest him, and the people nearest him turned, and a slight change began to move through the room, a quieting, a reorientation, the particular adjustment that very large rooms make when they understand that something requires their attention. Edmund came back to her. He stood beside her, turned toward the room. Lord Latimer spoke. He was good at this. He had hosted enough events to know how to make a room attend without making it feel commanded. He said, with the pleasant authority of a man sharing something worthwhile, that he was delighted to confirm the news that many had been curious about, and that he was pleased to make it properly known that the Duke of Strelin was pursuing a formal courtship of Miss Marguerite Whitmore, and that he hoped everyone would join him in wishing them well. The room received this. In the moment after, which was only a few seconds, but which seemed to Marguerite to last considerably longer, she became aware of several things simultaneously. She became aware of the fact that 150 people were now looking at her, or most of them were, which was a sensation she had never experienced, and which was simultaneously less frightening and more overwhelming than she would have predicted. She became aware of Edmund beside her, completely steady, not performing composure, but simply having it. She became aware of her mother, whom she could see across the room, standing beside Eleanor, both of them still and arrested, and trying, she could tell even from this distance, to determine what expression was most appropriate to produce. She became aware of Eleanor. Eleanor was looking at her from across the room, not with triumph or with injury, but with something that was harder to name. Marguerite looked back at her sister, and in the distance between them, over the heads of 150 people who were now talking and turning and beginning the business of making this evening's information into tomorrow's conversation, something passed between the two of them that was cleaner and more honest than most things they had exchanged in years. Edmund said, very quietly, beside her, "How are you?" She thought about this for a moment. She thought about it genuinely, which was the only way she ever thought about anything. She said, "I am the most frightened and the most certain I have ever been, at the same time." He said, "That is the correct way to feel." She looked at him. "You have experienced this." "When I decided to write you the first letter," he said, "I sat with it for 2 days before I sent it." She had not known this. 2 days. "I wrote it and then did not send it for 2 days, because I was not certain I had the right to begin something I could not guarantee I was capable of following through on. I sent it when I decided that not sending it was the worst choice." She looked at him for a long moment. Around them the room was fully engaged now, with the news and with itself, and with the social machinations that news always set in motion. But right here, in this small space between them, the room was just light and sound at a distance. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." He said, "I thought you should know." She looked back at the room, at all the people who were now looking at her, or talking about her, or deciding what they thought, which would take some of them the whole evening, and some of them the rest of the season, and some of them longer still. She thought about the conversations that would happen tomorrow, in drawing rooms, and at breakfast tables, and in letters passed between friends. She thought about what it would mean to be visible in this way, to be the subject of attention rather than the absence of it. She found, examining this thought, that she was not afraid of it. She had been afraid of many things in her life. She had been afraid of being wrong about herself, of the slow accumulation of overlooked years, adding up to a verdict that she was in fact nothing particular. She had been afraid of wanting things she was not going to be given. She had been afraid, in a very quiet and private way, of spending her entire life at the edge of rooms, watching other people stand in the middle. She was not afraid of any of those things anymore. Or not in the way she had been. They were still there, somewhere in the distance, but they were smaller now, and she was standing somewhere else. The next morning, the letters arrived before breakfast. Not one letter, but 6. By the time Marguerite had come downstairs and Mrs. Dunning had brought in the post, there were 2 more. By noon, the total was 14. By the following day, it had become absurd. Notes and cards and letters and invitations, a cascade of correspondence from people who had, until the previous evening, not found any particular reason to correspond with her, addressed to her specifically, using her name with a clarity and a care that she found quietly remarkable, given that most of these people could not have told you her name with confidence 2 weeks ago. She read them with the same attention she gave everything, and she felt, reading them, the exact compound of things that she had expected to feel, a warmth that was genuine, a skepticism that was equally genuine, and the particular kind of clear-eyed composure that comes from understanding something before it has arrived, which she did, because she had understood from the beginning that this world would know her exactly as well as it needed to and no better. She did not resent this. She had never been under the illusion that the social world ran on anything other than the mechanics of interest and association. She had simply always existed outside those mechanics, or on their edges. Now she was inside them. The mechanics had not changed. Her mother had changed, though. This was the thing that surprised her most in the days following the reception. Catherine Whitmore did not apologize. She was not, constitutionally, someone who apologized, and Marguerite had never expected her to be. But she had changed in a way that was, in its own terms, more significant than apology. She had stopped managing Marguerite. Not entirely. Her mother was 61 years old and had been managing things for 40 years, and some habits are older than intention. But she had stopped managing Marguerite in the particular way she had always done it, the way that assumed the management was necessary, because nothing good was going to arrive on its own. She now asked Marguerite's opinion on things. Not all things, and not always with the manner of someone who planned to act on the opinion. But she asked. She looked at her differently. Something behind the eyes had repositioned itself, and had not, apparently, moved back. Eleanor was another matter. Marguerite had expected Eleanor to struggle with this. She had prepared herself for the struggle, for the silences that meant injury, or the comments that looked like support from the outside, but contained something sharp on the inside if you pressed them. She had prepared herself with the general preparation of someone who knew the terrain. What she had not prepared for was Eleanor appearing in her doorway 3 days after the reception, with a face that was completely unguarded, and sitting down in the chair by the window, and saying, after a long silence, "I am sorry about the plan." Marguerite looked at her. "I know. Not because it failed," Eleanor said. "That is not why I am sorry. I am sorry because I agreed to it at all. Because I stood in the parlor while Mother described it, and I did not say that it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong." She paused. "I agreed because I was frightened." "I know that too," Marguerite said. Eleanor looked at her. "You are not angry." "I was angry for a day," Marguerite said, honestly. "And then I thought about the fact that you spent your entire life being told that you were the one worth caring about, and I spent mine being told the opposite. And neither of those is a position that makes it easy to be a fair person. So no, I am not angry." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not think he would see you." A pause. "That is the thing I keep returning to. I did not think anyone would look past me and choose you. And what that means about how I see you is something I am not comfortable with." "It means you saw what you were shown," Marguerite said. "We were both shown the same thing. I was just not convinced by it." Eleanor laughed. It was a small laugh, real, without beauty or performance. "You have always been the most infuriating person," she said. "You have always been the most beautiful one," Marguerite replied. "We have our respective roles." "No," Eleanor said, with unexpected force. "No, that is exactly what I do not want anymore. I am tired of being the beautiful one. It is the emptiest thing anyone has ever called me, and it is the thing I am called most." She looked at the window. "Harold sent a letter last week." "What did it say?" "He is engaged to someone in Edinburgh. He says he hopes I will understand." A pause. "I do understand. He met me twice and talked to me for a total of perhaps 90 minutes, and decided on that basis that I was not what he wanted. I do not blame him. I do not think he saw anything real." She stopped. "I have never made it easy for people to see anything real." Marguerite said gently, "That is something you can change." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and stood up and smoothed her dress and went back to her own room. And Marguerite heard the door close behind her, with the quiet certainty of someone who had said what needed to be said, and was now going to think about it privately and carefully. She turned back to her writing desk. She had been in the middle of a letter to Edmund, which she had left half-written when Eleanor knocked. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Something is changing in my family. Not as dramatically as the outside world might imagine. We are not a family that changes dramatically. We are a family that adjusts slowly and without announcement. But it is changing. My mother asked my opinion on the arrangement of the parlor furniture this morning, and then actually moved a chair based on my answer, which I believe may be the first time in my life that has happened. My sister said something to me today that was the most honest thing she has said to me in years." She paused. Then she wrote, "I have spent a long time being the background. It is strange to be the foreground. I am not sure I know quite how to do it yet." She put down the pen and read the sentence back. It was true. And it was the kind of true that she would not have said to many people, but that she could say to him, which was still something she was getting used to. The particular freedom of a relationship built on honesty from the beginning, where the habit of directness was already established and did not need to be worked up to. She picked up the pen again and wrote, "I think I will learn." The weeks that followed were the strangest and most vivid of her life. She was, for the first time, fully visible in a world that had previously treated her as a pleasant but unnecessary member of the background. This visibility had a specific texture to it. It was not comfortable, exactly. Not in the way that invisibility had been comfortable, but it was real, and the realness of it was something she had not expected to find as sustaining as she did. People spoke to her, specifically and with interest, not the polite minimum of social obligation. They asked her opinions, and they waited for her to answer. Women who had previously moved past her in rooms now sought her out in them. She received invitations addressed to her alone, not as an addendum to her family, not as Eleanor's less interesting sister. Her name was being said correctly, with the full weight of a person who was known. She handled all of this with the same quality she had brought to the rest of her life, carefully and honestly, and without performance. She did not become someone else. She did not learn the arts of social charm that she had never had and had never particularly wanted. She continued to say what she thought and to listen when other people spoke, and to be in rooms the way she had always been in them, attentive and real, without decoration. And somehow, perhaps because it was so different from what people were used to, this worked. It worked better than she would have predicted. She found that people, given the choice between a performance and a real thing, were often more drawn to the real thing than they themselves might have predicted. Edmund visited regularly. He had what she recognized as a deliberate approach to this, not coming so often that it created the impression of urgency, not so rarely that it created the impression of distance. She was learning, a man who thought carefully about the impression of things, not because he was dishonest, but because he understood that impressions had consequences, and that managing them was a form of care for the people involved. He managed the impression of their courtship with the same attention he brought to everything, and she appreciated this even when it occasionally frustrated her, which it did. She told him, one afternoon at the house, that she sometimes found his management of things slightly exhausting. He said, "Which things specifically?" She said, "The pacing, the care. Sometimes I think you have calculated everything, and I am not sure where the calculation ends and the feeling begins." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very directly, "The feeling has always come first. The calculation is what I do with the feeling, to avoid acting on it badly. It is not a replacement for it. It is a container for it." She thought about this. That is a reasonable explanation. "I am a reasonable person," he said, "most of the time." "And unreasonably?" she asked. He looked at her. "I wrote you a letter and sat on it for 2 days, because I was frightened of what it might mean if you did not write back." She felt this in her chest. "I would have written back," she said. "I did not know that yet," he said. "I had to become willing to not know it." She understood this. It was the same thing she had done with every part of this, with the letter, with Clara, with her mother, with the reception. The willingness to not know and to proceed anyway, because the alternative was a kind of safety that was also a kind of nothing. She said, "We are both, I think, people who have learned to be very careful about wanting things." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think we might both have to unlearn some of that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, "I think you are right." She heard what people were saying about her. There was no way to avoid it, and she did not try. The columns that concerned themselves with such things had, in the weeks following the palace reception, produced a steady output of commentary on the match between the Duke of Strelin and the second Whitmore daughter. She did not read these columns herself. She had never read them, and she was not going to start. But she heard what was in them through the ordinary channels of her social world. Clara read them, and mentioned, without quoting, what they generally said. The women she encountered at various events let things slip in the oblique manner that people use when they want you to know something, and also want to appear not to be the one telling you. Her mother occasionally left a column open on the table at a particular page without comment. The commentary was, she gathered, mixed. This did not surprise her. Some of it was generous. Several accounts described the match as romantic, a word she had complicated feelings about, because romantic tended to mean something had surprised people, and they had no more analytical category for it, which was better than hostility, but not quite as satisfying as comprehension. Some accounts noted that the Duke was known for being difficult to please, and that this was evidence of his particular character and good judgment. A few, she heard from Clara with some amusement, had taken the position that there must be more to Marguerite Whitmore than her social appearances had suggested, which was true, but was being said as though it were a discovery rather than a fact that had simply been unnoticed. Some of it was less generous. There was a strain of commentary. She could hear it even through the filters of Clara's careful reporting, that questioned the match in a specific way. It could not be entirely open about the nature of the question, because the question was, essentially, Why would a man of his position choose a woman without outstanding beauty or particular social distinction? And the answer that kept presenting itself was either that he had been deceived or that something was wrong with him. There were, she knew, women and families who had spent the season angling for the Duke's attention with what they considered every advantage, and who were now required to understand that those advantages had counted for nothing, which was an understanding that came with some bitterness attached to it. She heard the commentary, and she let it move through her without catching. She had been the object of other people's assessments for her entire life. She had learned, somewhere in her mid-teens, that she could not control the assessments, and she could not particularly change them, and she could not benefit from caring about them. And so she had stopped caring about them, not as a performance of dignity, but as a genuine and practical decision. This skill was, she was discovering, more useful now than it had ever been when she was invisible, because now the assessments were louder and more present and came from more directions. There was one conversation she had not expected, and which came from a direction she had not anticipated. Lady Pemberton visited the Whitmore house in the 3rd week of November. This in itself was unusual. Lady Pemberton was not a woman who made social calls without significant motivation, and she had not, to Marguerite's knowledge, called on the Whitmore family in any personal capacity in the past several years. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and was received by Marguerite's mother in the parlor, and Marguerite was present because she happened to be in the house, and Lady Pemberton, after the initial exchange of pleasantries, turned to Marguerite with the particular focus of a woman who has come specifically to say something and has been deciding how to say it. She said, "I want to speak frankly, if you will allow it." Marguerite said, "I almost always prefer it." Lady Pemberton said, "I have known Edmund Cavendish since he was a very small boy, because his family and mine had adjacent properties, and we spent portions of every summer in reasonable proximity. I want you to know that I consider him to be, at his core, a good man. Not an easy one, not a simple one, but a good one. And I want you to know that in all the years I have known him, I have not seen him look at another person the way I saw him look at you at the palace reception." Marguerite held Lady Pemberton's gaze. "That is generous of you to say." "It is honest, which is not the same thing," Lady Pemberton said. "I am not here to give you my approval, because it is not mine to give, and because you do not need it. I am here because I thought someone should tell you that the people who are questioning this match have, in my observation, been looking for the wrong things in the wrong places, and that you should not let their confusion become your doubt." Her mother, who had been sitting very still on the other side of the room, said, quietly, "Thank you, Margaret." Lady Pemberton nodded, and then efficiently changed the subject to something about the winter charitable concert, and the conversation moved on, and after she left, Marguerite sat for a long time with what had been said. She wrote to Edmund that evening. She told him about Lady Pemberton's visit. She said that she had not expected it, and had not known quite how to receive it in the moment, but that in the quiet of the evening, she found she was more moved by it than she had expected to be. He wrote back, "Lady Pemberton is one of the people in the world I trust most. She does not say things for decoration. If she came to say that, she meant it." She wrote, "I know. That is what moved me." He wrote also, "I should tell you that she wrote to me on the same day. She said she had spoken to you, and she wanted me to know that she thought I had, in her words, finally done something right." Marguerite laughed. It was a genuine and unguarded laugh, alone in her room at her writing desk, the kind of laugh that arrived without planning. She thought about Lady Pemberton going home and writing to both of them on the same day, handling the situation with the thorough practicality of someone who had decided that two people needed to hear a thing and had simply made sure they both heard it. She wrote, "I like her very much." He wrote back, "I know. She is going to like you too. She is very particular about who she likes, which means the liking, when it comes, is worth something." She thought about this for a while after she put down the pen. She thought about the particular value of approval from people who were particular about where their approval went. She thought about the women she respected, Clara, who never said more than she meant, Lady Pemberton, whose directness was its own form of respect, Mrs. Dunning, whose loyalty was entirely without drama. She thought about what she wanted to build, going forward, and with whom. There was, she was beginning to understand, a life available to her that was not the life she had been preparing herself for. She had been preparing, without quite acknowledging it, for a life that was contained and quiet and managed and largely invisible. A good enough life, a respectable life, the life of a woman who had been looked past and had made the best of it. She had been preparing for that life with a thoroughness that she now recognized as a form of self-protection, because expecting less was a reliable way of not being hurt by the gap between what you wanted and what you got. That life was no longer the one she was in. This should have been straightforwardly good news. In many ways it was. But it was also disorienting in a way she had not expected, because she had to dismantle some of the preparations, the careful management of expectation, the habit of minimizing her own wishes, the specific interior arrangement of a person who has decided that wanting too much is dangerous. She had to let these go, and letting them go was harder than she would have thought, because they had been useful for a long time. She said this to Edmund. Not all of it, not at once, but in pieces, over several conversations and letters. She said she was still getting used to being wanted. She said that she sometimes caught herself waiting for the part where it turned out to be a mistake, which she knew was irrational but could not entirely help. She said that she thought she had spent so many years as the second choice, the overlooked one, the background, that her instinct in moments of genuine goodness was still to look for the error in it. He listened to all of this. He did not offer reassurances or arguments against her concerns, or the kind of insistent warmth that would have suggested he had not really heard her. He said, after a long pause in one of their conversations, "I understand that completely. I spent 6 years after my father died waiting for the estate to fail, for the mistake I had made to become visible, for the moment when it became clear that I was not adequate to the position I had been given. The waiting itself became the problem." He paused. What helped was not being told that the thing I feared would not happen. It was evidence, actual evidence, over time, that it was not happening. She said, "So you are saying I need to wait?" He said, "I am saying you need to watch. There is a difference. Waiting is passive. Watching is something you do with your eyes open." She thought about this. "I have always been good at watching." "Yes," he said, "I know. It is one of the first things I noticed about you." She asked him what the second thing was. He said, without hesitation, that you said exactly what you thought and did not look around afterward to see if you had said the right thing. She said, "Is that a good thing?" He said, "It is the thing I have been looking for, without knowing it, for years." She held that for a while. She held it the way she had held the first letter, on the stone wall in the garden, with the apple tree and the gray sky, and the slow understanding that something was happening that she had not known to plan for. She wrote to him, "I am choosing to watch, not to wait. I am watching closely, and I am finding, every day, that the evidence is accumulating in one direction." He wrote back, "So am I." The wedding was in February. Not because February was anyone's first choice for a wedding. It was cold and gray, and the daylight lasted approximately 5 minutes longer than December. But because Edmund said he did not see any reason to delay it into spring, and Marguerite agreed with him. And when both of the people getting married agreed on something so fundamental as timing, the rest of the conversation was relatively short. Her mother had initial objections on the grounds of propriety and preparation, and the fact that February was not a wedding month, and several other reasons that she produced in rapid succession one evening at the dinner table. Marguerite listened to all of them with her usual attention, and then said, simply, that she and Edmund had decided, and that she would appreciate her mother's help in making it well. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. That particular look that had appeared with increasing frequency since the palace reception, the look of reassessment, and then said that she would need to speak to the dressmaker immediately, and left the room with the purposeful energy of someone who had converted her objection into a project. Eleanor helped with the dress. This had not been planned and was not requested. Eleanor appeared one morning in Marguerite's room while the dressmaker was there, sat down without being invited, and began to contribute opinions with the expertise of a woman who had spent her entire life being fitted for things, and who therefore knew, genuinely and in detail, what worked on a person and what did not. She and Marguerite disagreed on 3 specific points and agreed on 4 more, and the dress that resulted was something that neither of them would have arrived at independently. This was, Marguerite thought, possibly the most characteristic thing about their relationship, better together than apart, though neither of them had ever been given sufficient reason to test it before. Clara came from Essex for a week before the wedding. She stayed in the guest room and spent most of her time in Marguerite's room, talking in the way that they always talked, broadly and without destination, moving between subjects with the ease of people who had been friends long enough to have accumulated a shared vocabulary. They talked about the letters, and about Edmund, and about the palace reception, and about Lady Pemberton, and about Eleanor, and about their mother, and they talked about all of it, with the honest directness that had always been the foundation of their friendship. Clara said, on the last evening before the wedding, "I want to say something that I have been deciding how to say for about 3 months." "Say it directly," Marguerite told her. "You always do eventually." Clara smiled. "All right, I want to say that I always knew you were this, not this," she gestured, indicating the room and the house, and presumably the circumstances in general. "But this." She put her hand briefly on Marguerite's arm. "The person that someone would find and not let go of. I always knew that was in you. I am glad the right person found it." Marguerite held this for a moment. Then she said, "You could have told me." "You would not have believed me," Clara said. Which was true. She would not have believed her. She had spent too long in the configuration of her life as it had been, too long as the second one, the overlooked one, the background, to have received that information and let it change anything. She would have heard it, stored it with warmth, and returned to her preparations for a smaller kind of life. The wedding day was cold and clear. The church was not enormous, but it was beautiful, in the way that old things are beautiful. Stone and light, and the accumulated quiet of many years of people coming to it in their moments of significance. Edmund's family filled one side of the church, aunts and cousins and a scattering of friends, whose presence indicated genuine regard rather than social obligation. The Whitmore family and their friends filled the other, and Marguerite walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and was aware, in a way she had never been aware of anything, of the room, and the light, and the sound of it, and of the fact that the man at the end of the aisle was watching her, the way she had learned he watched the things he considered important. Without performance, without social gloss, with the complete and genuine attention of someone who had found what he was looking for, and knew it. She did not cry. She was not, as a rule, someone who cried easily, and today was not the day she was going to start. She kept her face clear, and her breath steady, and her eyes on him. And when her father placed her hand in Edmund's, she felt, as she had felt at the palace reception, and at the library, and on the stone wall in the garden, the particular compound of feelings that she had come to understand was simply how it felt to be in a real thing, some fear, considerable warmth, and underneath both of them, steady as the floor, a certainty she had built from evidence. They said their vows. The church was very quiet. Her mother, she noticed with a small and private feeling she did not have a name for, was crying. Not dramatically. Her mother was not, in the end, a dramatic person despite everything. She was sitting in the front pew with a handkerchief at the corner of her eye and a composure that was only partially intact, and she was looking at Marguerite with the expression that had replaced the old one and which Marguerite had still not entirely learned to read. Eleanor was not crying. Eleanor was watching, the way she had always been good at watching when she was not performing, and her face was the open and unguarded one that Marguerite had seen more of in the past 2 months than in the preceding 20 years. She was going to be all right, Eleanor. Marguerite believed this. She was going to take the things she had learned and do something different with them, and it might take time, and it might not look the way she had always imagined it would look. But Eleanor was not, at her core, a person without substance. She had simply spent her whole life being valued for something else. After the ceremony, in the brief moment between the church and the waiting carriages, Marguerite stood beside Edmund in the cold February light and looked at the people around them, her family and his family, and their collected friends, all of them moving and talking and producing the warm, ordinary noise of people happy to be present. And she thought about the letter on the stone wall, which had arrived before she had any particular reason to expect anything, addressed specifically to her, and had begun everything. She thought about what it meant to have been overlooked, genuinely and completely, for so long, and to have been found anyway. Not because she had changed or performed or arranged herself differently, not because she had competed and won or outmaneuvered anyone or even tried to, but because a man had stood in a room and looked past everything that was supposed to be looked at and found her, specifically, in the place where she had always been. Edmund said, quietly beside her. "What are you thinking?" She said, "I am thinking about the fact that I was on a stone wall in the garden reading your first letter, and I was telling myself it was probably not going to be anything." He said, "Were you convincing yourself?" She thought about this honestly. "No," she said, "not entirely." He said, "Neither was I. When I sat with the letter for 2 days before sending it, I was not primarily afraid that you would not write back. I was afraid of how much it mattered that you would." She looked at him. He was standing in the February light, with the steady attentiveness she had come to love. And she had come to love it, that was the right word. She had arrived at the word somewhere in November, and had kept it for herself for a while, and had said it for the first time in the last letter she had sent before the wedding. And his expression was the open one, the one beneath the management, the one that came when he had decided to stop containing something. She said, "I think we were both afraid of the same thing." He said, "Probably. That tends to be true." "And now?" she asked. He said, "Now I am not afraid. I am very aware that everything is going to be difficult and complicated and occasionally overwhelming, because everything real is those things. But I am not afraid of it." She said, "Neither am I." They stood in the February cold, and around them their families talked and laughed and produced the ordinary warm sounds of people at the beginning of something, and the sky above them was the particular bright gray of a winter morning that was not going to produce much weather, but was not going to disappear either. And Marguerite Cavendish, formerly Whitmore, formerly the second daughter, formerly the background, formerly the woman that nobody had ever particularly thought to look at, stood in the clear winter light and felt the specific and permanent quality of a life that had been, against all the predictions of everyone who thought they knew her, genuinely and completely chosen. Years later, people would ask how she had done it. Not the wedding, not the marriage, not the practical matter of it, but how she had come to be the woman she became, the one who was sought out, consulted, written about with the same admiration that had once been reserved entirely for her sister, the one whose marriage was remembered not as a social event but as a love story, which is a different and better thing, the one whose children, 3 of them, grew up in a house where the quiet people were listened to as carefully as the bright ones, because their mother had built a household on that principle, and it had, she found, become the most natural thing in the world. When asked, she gave different answers on different occasions, because the full answer was long and honest and required more time than most conversations allowed. But there was one answer she gave most often, because it was the simplest and the most complete. She said, "I never tried to be anything other than what I was. And I kept saying true things, even when true things were less comfortable than the other kind, and eventually, the right person heard one of them." And then she said, because she was, as she had always been, thoroughly honest, it helped that he was listening.